Hello, everyone. My name is Dejion Hughes, and I have my counterparts here, Miss Katelyn, Miss Erin, and we're going to talk to you all about drugs and juvenile delinquency and their connection to one another as it relates to the juvenile justice system. So, Katelyn, if you don't mind, could you please scroll to the next slide? So, before the video plays, I just want to let you know what this video is about. It's basically going to provide some history of the juvenile justice system before we get into the drug related to juvenile delinquency. We wanted you to understand what the juvenile justice history, so you can have a background and an understanding of what and how all of this came about. So you can go ahead and play the video.
America's criminal justice system has never treated all citizens equal. To understand how we got here, we need to take a look at the evolution of the juvenile justice system. Before the American Revolution, the colonies followed the common law of England when it came to criminal justice. This means that children were held accountable as adults. In 1646, Puritans in Massachusetts enacted a statute called the Stubborn Child Law. This made child disobedience a capital offense, allowing a death penalty option. But then things started to change. In the 19th century, the idea emerged that children should be taken care of by the state. This notion ultimately empowered the state to serve as a guardian. In 1825, the New York House of Refuge opened for juveniles only. They were called delinquents to distinguish them from criminals. Reformers stressed that delinquents could be reformed, and if properly supported, they wouldn't turn into lifelong criminals. In 1899, Chicago reformers, also known as child savers, many of them disenfranchised women, decided to fight for the defenseless. One reformer, Lucy Flower, had been an orphan herself. The child savers pushed for the creation of the first ever juvenile court. This wasn't like a regular court. There was no jury. The judge didn't look down from a bench, but sat at a desk. Julian Mack, one of the first such judges, said a kid should be made to feel that he is the object of its care and solicitude. This court was the first of its kind anywhere in the world. Kids didn't get prison time, but instead were put in institutions or programs. Like parents, the court tried to steer kids toward becoming responsible adults. Within 25 years, most states started to think the same thing. Juvenile courts popped up everywhere, even in other countries. But for children of color, things were different. They were sometimes banned from houses of refuge or juvenile detention centers, and when convicted, they were more likely to be placed in adult prisons. Under Jim Crow laws, some cities like Memphis established separate juvenile courts for kids of color. A police officer, not a judge, presided over this court. After World War II, Americans seemed to relish the concepts of liberty and justice. The civil rights movement was well underway. Activists began to realize that while juvenile courts were designed to be less punitive, they didn't provide the constitutional rights enjoyed by adults. In 1967, for instance, 15-year-old Gerald Galt was accused of making an indecent phone call to a neighbor. Gerald was arrested without anyone informing his parents. No record was made of his appearance before a judge or the neighbor who complained. Gerald was committed to a state school until he was 21. An adult with the same charge might have received a $50 fine and 2 months incarceration. Gerald's parents brought his case to the Supreme Court. In 1967, that august body ruled that juveniles were entitled to due process. Then in the 70s, America started rethinking its criminal justice system. Crime had spiked, including juvenile crime. And in 1978, New York City passed the Juvenile Offender Act, a law that made it possible to try kids as young as 13 in adult court for murder charges and as young as 14 for other violent crimes like assault and robbery. That law caused states across the country to reinterpret who could enter the prison system as an adult. They were afraid that a new breed of super predators would sweep over the nation. Today, America incarcerates more juveniles than any country in the world. Every day, 53,000 children are locked up. That's more than a sold-out crowd at a Major League Baseball game. Nearly 60% of these children are Black or Latinx. Today, certain rights, like the Sixth Amendment and the right to a speedy trial or a trial by jury, remains only applicable to adults. Advocates have succeeded in getting almost all states to raise the age at which you are considered an adult to 18. But if you commit certain severe crimes, you can still be tried as an adult in the adult court and serve adult time.
Okay, so after watching that video, and it provided a lot of, you know, important information that we needed to know as it relates to the juvenile justice system. And I mean, it's way bigger than just that little clip, but I think it summed it all up pretty well. Now, as the connection goes with the juvenile justice system and juvenile delinquency as it connects to drug usage, we're going to get more in depth with this. So moving on, the problem at hand here that we've come up with, we identified this as the major thing here. There has been an increase in juveniles being placed in the juvenile justice system. As the video told you, there's like over 50,000 children being put in these juvenile juvenile prisons, juvenile detention centers, and we are like topped in the nation. But back to the slide. Juvenile justice system. No, that slide. I'm sorry. There is the juvenile justice system due to their increase in drug usage and recidivism of delinquent behavior. The abuse of drugs and delinquent behaviors have become popularized as youth are exposed to these behaviors through their community, their peers, and social media. So with that being said, literally all they have to do is pick up their phone and they see it. So it's like they're more prone to be able to exhibit these behaviors. Or even with video games, not saying it's the sole it's the main issue or the reason why delinquency happens, but it could play a major part in it. So if you think back a couple years ago, I mean, just years when you were growing up, you may have not been able to access a smartphone at the time when you were, you know, maybe 10 or 13. Maybe you had a little flip phone. Maybe you had a little track phone. Maybe you had Net 10. Either way, we didn't have that much accessibility to things as the youth do today. Okay, you can go to the next slide. So how has OJJ tackled it today? And OJJ stands for the Office of Juvenile Justice, basically the juvenile justice system for those who don't know. They have used, number one, evidence-based research and treatment, such as motivational interviewing. And what that is basically the justice system. They use it to enhance communication, build rapport. So, you know, sort of like all social workers or anyone does when they're beginning to meet someone for the first time. They build rapport with these with the clients, with the juveniles. And then after building rapport, they motivate the offenders into changing their behavior. So they have motivational interviewing. It basically helps to change their behavior. They also use it as a part of its LAMOD process approach, and the secure care as a non-confrontational approach. So this information is coming strictly from the Louisiana Department of Juvenile Justice. This is what they're using to tackle this now, these issues of drug abuse with juvenile delinquencies. And yeah, this is how they're tackling it now. They also use the Thinking for Change model. It's an integrated 25 lesson CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, where program where they use it for youth, cognitive restructuring, teaching social skills, social development skills, and problem solving skills. So they use this technique in order to get the juvenile to think about their actions and change it. So it all goes back to changing their behavior. Next, they use functional family therapy. And that's basically where they have a highly successful family intervention. And they take this and they bring the entire family in, and they work together not only with the youth or the offender, but the entire family. So basically including the entire family unit in the support, getting the family unit to support the change in what they want to see in the youth or the offender. And it also focuses on youth with problems such as conduct disorder, violent acting out, substance abuse issues. So it definitely correlates and connects with our topic here today. They also use something called MST. MST is abbreviated for multisystemic therapy, and it's basically an intensive family and community-based treatment program. So it's not something that happens outside of, it happens in the community, it happens in the home. They use this as a measure to basically bring the treatment options to your home. So the child doesn't have to be in prison. It doesn't have to be in the detention center. And they get all these community partners and basically work as like a multidisciplinary team. Another thing that they use is supervision, probation, and parole. It's sort of kind of like, the adult probation and parole, but it's also a lot different. What they use is the probation and parole officers. They basically track the youth, making sure that they stay on track with things, making sure that they are working their plan, their care plan, ensuring that they're going to school, ensuring that they're not, engaging in delinquent activities. They continue to advocate for the children and the youth and the juveniles. They continue to refer and coordinate services for the youth and the family. Also, just helping the youth become, an upstanding citizen. I mean, everyone makes mistakes. Everyone has done things that others don't know about, honestly. But if all of that was brought to the forefront, of course, we would have to do some restructuring, some regrouping. So that's what the probation officer's role is in helping and changing the youth in the OJJ system. The parole officers do a lot more as well, such as like conducting risk assessments, serving as a case manager, but that's just to name a few. I'll let you guys do more of the research on that. But moving forward, they also have these secure care facilities. And basically, if a youth is seen as a threat to themselves and to the public, they're placed in these secure care facilities where the youth is monitored literally 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, under direct supervision. They're housed in dormitories or housing units, basically like a mini prison. This is more of your detention centers. So if a youth commits, a heinous crime or a strenuous crime, and they will be housed at the secure unit, even such as like hospitals or something like that. If they have severe mental problems, they will be housed in a secure mental institution. And they also have what is called the unsecure care, which is also called the community residential care. And this is basically like your group homes. Of course, they have staff there who oversee them, but it's more free. it's a little bit more freedom. It's not in the home, but it's placed in another setting, care setting, where they can, receive the help and the intervention that they need. You can move to the next slide. So when we talk about the analytics of things, and when we talk about how, the impact of drugs on juvenile delinquency and its place in the juvenile justice system, we have to look at the numbers. That's all to it. We have to look at the numbers. Just in 2017, OJJ reported there were 682 youth served in secure custody. So could be, like I said, detention centers, mental hospitals, things of that nature. But though it was down 23% from 2016, they haven't really updated it since I haven't found any updated information for Louisiana past the fiscal year of 2017. But just imagine, it was down at that point, but with so many things, the pandemic currently, and so many things going on today, I'm pretty sure that 682 has increased because, but back on topic. There were also 572 youth served in non-secure custody, and it went up by 10%. So just imagine that as well. And a lot of things in today, I know with a lot of different laws changing and things, they're moving away from the group homes, the foster care. So just imagine those children, those youth, those juveniles who were usually placed in group homes, usually placed here, could be now in secure custody because there aren't any, group homes, or, well, there are less. I don't want to say there aren't any. Back to the numbers, 94% of the youth, 94% of the youth who are taken in to the juvenile justice system or into custody because of their delinquent acts are in fact male. 6% are female. 83% is African American. And just like the video pointed out, that of course African Americans, were treated differently when it came to the juvenile justice system. In my opinion, this is not factual. I haven't researched this. In my opinion, just me being, an African American male, you immediately get this perception of, when you see an African American male, it immediately provokes fear for some reason to, certain people. And they immediately are stereotyped regardless. If you just see a very stocky, African American male, that is for sure, you immediately, feel threatened. And I mean, that can be supported with the recent, if you turn on the news, all of the killings, police officers, police brutality and stuff like that. But that's a whole nother topic for another day. Moving on, 17% of the those picked up in custody by OJJ is white or other. So again, the African American youth are disproportionately represented in every custody and supervision status. And that's just the numbers. We can't argue with the facts. We can't argue with the numbers. You can go to the next slide. So one thing that during doing some research, I realized that of a lot of people, a lot of parishes and states use MST, the multisystemic therapy. But just digging, I saw that the moral I'm gonna butcher this word, but y'all just work with me. The moral recognition, however you want to pronounce it, therapy, it actually works as well. and it's used to reduce. It's focused on. It can be used with juveniles or adults, but its focus is to reduce substance abuse in juvenile delinquents. They partner the cognitive behavioral theory approach and just, putting some moral reasoning behind it to reduce these risks and to reduce the substance abuse. Again, it's the systematic treatment strategy that seeks to decrease the recidivism, receive the repeated actions. I'm sorry. Um, Among juvenile and adult criminal offenders. Like I said, by increasing moral reasoning. It combines the CBT approach, like I stated, the cognitive behavioral theory, addressing ego, social, moral, and positive behavior growth. They focus directly on 7 basic treatment issues: confrontation of beliefs and attitudes and behaviors. That's number 1. Number 2, assesses current relationships, which could also be partnered with the relational theory. Number 3, reinforcement of positive behavior and habits. Number 4, positive identity formation. Number 5, enhancement of self-concept. Number 6, decrease in hedonism and development of frustration tolerance. A lot of us outside of delinquency need to focus on that, but that's neither here or there. Development of higher stages of moral reasoning. Just being able to say, hey, look, listen, this is like not of good moral status. And you can now go to the next slide as I hand it off to my counterpart, Miss Katelyn Rodriguez. Take it away.
Thank you, Dejion. Okay, we're going to get through the literature reviews, just different variables that can affect juvenile delinquency and drug use. And we're just going to do like brief bits of each source. So this one was about just the relationship of substance abuse and delinquency, and it's positive and it's strong. So there is a correlation between drug use and delinquency. This study just looked at high schoolers, and they noticed that gender, socioeconomic, and skipping a grade level can all produce delinquent behaviors. Alcohol and drug were also incorporated with delinquent behaviors, and smoking was also a factor. This next article looked at youths and their trajectories, which was interesting. They broke it up in 5 stages. And so occurrence, deviant investment, sequential deviance, and compulsion, and then the rehabilitation. We're just going to talk about the first 3 because that's where most youths will lie. The last 2 are the more severe. So we're not going to go into that. Like Dejion said, you all can do some extra research, but it's pretty self-explanatory. On rehabilitation stage, you go to rehab or you relapse, and then compulsion stage is more of just that, like, honestly, just your body needing it. It's the more severe stage of addiction. So let's go through the first 3. Occurrence, it's when people, get introduced to drugs. Curiosity, family identity, pleasure, belonging to a peer group. And I thought this was interesting. Drugs used to spend on illegal income. So if they're a youth, they don't have a bank account. And if they have income coming from other things that may be illegal, gambling, stealing, they'll use that money and they'll buy drugs with it to try to kind of get rid of that money so the parents don't notice. The next stage is the deviant investment stage, which is like pleasure reinforcement. It's more when they I like the feeling of being high or being drunk. Affiliation desire is I want to be affiliated with this peer group, so I will use. And then crime facilitation, it's just you're engaging in crime acts, so you might as well drink or smoke with that peer group as well. The majority of people are in the occurrence stage. And so we can look at the occurrence stage and we can, look at why they're starting to use, and then we can try to kind of work from there. And then the third one is a sequential stage, and it's marking events. So if you can kind of hear people say this, my drug use really spiraled when I got in that car accident, when I lost my home, when my parents got divorced. These are marking events where they kind of notice their drug use spiked, and that's the more severe drug use. And then, other deviant opportunities and lucrative crimes to support their regular drug use. So they're kind of getting engaged in more serious crimes to get those drugs because they need the drugs. All right, this next article is the impacts of the age. So this study looked at young men ages 18 to 24 in African-American households in the lower income urban communities. And they found that if this man used drugs at 16 years or younger, they were fourfold greater to be incarcerated for a substance use offense. So if they, were introduced to drugs at 16 from that current stage that we just talked about, they were more likely to have a charge with substance abuses involved, as opposed to those that never touched a substance abuse. This next one was really nice to read. It's just changing our perspective on delinquent youths. We need to change our perspective as social workers and as a community. We shouldn't view them as a problem. They're more of a resource and an asset. And so if we change our perspective that way, a lot of things will just naturally start improving. It starts with us and in our heart. So if we change our perspective on what's going on, there's a lot of variables that are affecting these youth. So if we identify those variables and we don't excuse them, then we're going to help them in the end. There's a lot of empirical research that supports protective assets, which is a strong family bond, a good school environment. That's a protective asset. And you can think of it as protecting the youth to not use drugs or not to go into delinquent acts. If they don't have protective assets, then they're less protected, meaning they'll fall into that behavior. This one was about integrated model of social and learning theory. They looked at the social and the learning theory and they put it together because, like we're seeing, this is very complex. So social learning theory looks at strong bonds. So if you have a strong bond, you're less likely to engage in delinquent behavior. If you don't have a strong bond, you are more likely to engage. So if you don't have a strong family bond, if you don't have a strong peer group, you're more likely. Learning theory is what we've all learned. Your peer group can teach you things and can teach you how to act in certain ways. So it's more of like peer group and the power of that. So we're going to combine the two to make it more comprehensive. But I thought that was interesting. But then I found this next theory, this next research that completely debunked the social control theory, saying that this guy that invented it, he's only looking at 1% to 2% of the variances in future delinquency. He's leaving out a lot of other variances that can affect delinquency. So it's problematic when we look at social control and we want to make interventions off of that theory when it's not really valid. So that's something we can always remember. This next one goes to the conduct disorder. Dejion mentioned this earlier, that if you have conduct disorder, you're more likely to have delinquent behavior and to use drugs. Actually, 53% of the juvenile justice and the youth meet the criteria for conduct disorder. That's a lot of youths that have conduct disorder in our juvenile justice system. So that's good to know because we can, we can intervene in the school and in the family and the community. What I thought was interesting too is conduct disorder, they have a positive attitude toward drugs, which means they don't think drugs are bad. And so if you have a positive attitude towards something, you're not going to stop it typically. So that's not a bad thing to know because it's a modifiable risk factor. So we can actually modify this positive attitude toward drugs through motivational interviewing, which Dejion mentioned earlier, and through contingency management, which is saying, if you don't do drugs, we're going to reward you for abstaining from drugs. So these are two things where we can block this positive viewpoint of drugs, especially in the conduct disorder population. This next one was violent delinquent behaviors and drug use. So if you were, kind of in a violent delinquent behavior, you had an increased risk of lifetime drug use, as opposed to someone that wasn't doing a violent behavior. So it's kind of a connection of the violent versus the nonviolent, which was kind of interesting also. And how can we combat this? Getting involved with the schools, getting involved with the juvenile justice system, and as social workers integrating for intervention and prevention. If we see violent acts at school, we kind of start noticing those, and then we tend to those behaviors because we don't want them to go, down that road with the drug use and the delinquent behavior. This one was really just breaking apart each structure of the behavior, saying there's an underlying structure of the behavior, the continuity of that behavior, or the change behavior through intervention, and then the risk and protective factors. So if someone has more protective factors, they're going to be more protected from going into the juvenile justice system. And if they don't have protective factors, they're at risk. And this one is about delinquency and the treatment and prevention. This is kind of just going over what Dejion said, multi-systemic therapy, big approach, 24-hour therapy, pro-social values in early childhood could actually get there before the multisystemic therapy, which is great. Multisystemic therapy is awesome. But that's usually when people have to land there. So if we intervene with pro-social values early on, we can hopefully have less people in that multisystemic intensive therapy later on. The Perry School Project actually focuses on the pro-social values at an early age. So if you see, we're going, Perry School Project, multisystemic therapy, and then like intervening within the school. So hopefully we're breaking down the probability of youths going into juvenile justice system. That's it. Erin, take it away.
So this is a quote from a source actually Katelyn read earlier that I wanted to just review because I feel like in terms of intervention, it's very notable and should be used in all programs, this mindset of, they asked the question, how can we reduce the risk for adolescents? And they said, we can reduce adolescent risk behaviors by changing our perspectives on them, viewing the youth as resources instead of potential problems. So if we view youth as resources, it provides them with a supportive environment that creates positive growth and development despite the potential adversity. So just the idea that, we're not viewing the youth as a problem, and these youths that are participating in substance use and then ending up in the juvenile justice system, if we view them as the problem, then it's never going to get fixed because it's their environment and it's the peer pressure and the drugs themselves that are the real issues. So, addressing the youth as having potential and just needing the support to grow and develop in the best way can help them overcome that adversity. So the book talked a lot about juvenile delinquency and drug use. And of course, a big intervention in terms of the system is law enforcement. And of course, there are pros and cons to law enforcement being involved. But some different areas that they tend to focus on is targeting dealers, source control, and border control. So obviously targeting dealers is especially useful for the large-scale drug rings. And of course, these are the people that are supplying our youth with the drugs. So they are the problem, and police then try to tackle that so that the drugs don't reach the youth. So they do what's called a drug sweep, and this is just kind of cracking down on the law, going out into the streets and, taking care of anyone that either is in possession or selling drugs in hopes of making it less enticing for them to want to buy drugs or use drugs, and then more difficult for them to get them, by their presence in these communities that have high crime rate, high drug usage. However, this tactic in recent studies has shown that this actually has led to more violence between police and youth, or the police and these drug dealers, as well as more crowded correctional facilities. So while this seems like cracking down could be a good thing because it deters them from using it, it's really actually caused more harm than good. But furthermore, just the idea of source control actually kind of stems into border control as well, because a lot of the drugs we have in the US, these illegal drugs, are coming from other countries. They're coming from these drug crops that are in these other countries, and this mass quantity of drugs is being sold, and they're trying to smuggle it into the US. So that's why, police and law enforcement are trying to protect the borders, trying to seize those drugs before they get into the country and into our communities and eventually into the hands of our youth. So again, that's hard to do. We have large borders, and there's a lot of ways now, especially with the use of the internet, that this drug trafficking can take place. But that is where, law enforcement is really trying to invest their time with this drug issue, because obviously if you stop it at the source, it's not going to affect our communities as much. So next slide. So moving on to educational interventions, DARE is a program I'm sure we all know and are aware of. It's drug abuse resistance education, a school-based program that's been used all over the country for many years. I know I participated in it in 4th and 5th grade. And while I remember participating in it, I would say that I don't really remember what they told me or what I learned or what their goal was. I just remember the police officer coming into the room, talking to us about drugs. I didn't know what a lot of that was. I don't remember what my awareness was at the time. So even in that perspective, while I didn't go on to use drugs, I still don't know what kind of impact it really had on myself and my classmates at such a young age. And I think the people that, run DARE on a national scale, they saw this issue that, they're trying to have this early intervention, but it wasn't really taking effect because of the way they were approaching it. So they started a new program within DARE called Take Charge of Your Life. And this is geared more towards the late middle school and early high school aged youth. And those are, of course, at the highest risk of being introduced to drugs and alcohol and tobacco. And this program was relying more on having them question their assumption about drug use. So taking what they think they know and putting it into reality of what it's really like to use drugs, the effects in terms of the law, as well as the physical harm that it can do to their bodies. And they're still using, the police officers and introducing it in a classroom setting, but instead of coming at it as like a lecturer perspective, they're trying to serve more as mentors and guidance, pushing them in a more positive direction. And again, this sounds great, and DARE is a good program. However, a recent study did show kind of the ineffectiveness even with these changes to the program. It showed that 3 to 4% of the youth that were in this program 2 years after had been participating in drug use, tobacco, alcohol, and other illegal substances. But another interesting statistic, while that is a negative one, in a positive light, there were youth that reported using marijuana before this program, and then after the program reported less use and less likelihood of using it in the future. So there were some pros and cons, but DARE has the right intention by going into the schools and just simply educating the youth on the effects and the harms of drug use. So prevention, this is another program, a community-based program called Across Ages. So this prevention tactic is like a mentoring program, kind of tackling the same age group as the DARE program, just that middle school range where I think kids are most impressionable, honestly, especially going through puberty, and you're, have a lot of insecurities and you want to just be like your peers. So if you're in an environment where your peers would be more likely to have a negative influence, this Across Ages program takes these youth, these at-risk youth, and pairs them with an older adult. And the goal is just to create that bond between the adult and the child, and so to provide them with a positive community involvement. So I like the idea of, they're putting them into the community, and one of the things they do is 2 hours of community service every week. And it's not seen as a punishment, but it's seen as this is what you can do for your community, and you can produce good things within your neighborhoods, even if your peers may be, participating in drugs or alcohol or other things that could harm the community. So I think that's a really great incentive for them. And as well as this adult is really just giving them that one-on-one attention. I think going back to what we've talked about before, how peers and family are largely impactful on the youth and the decisions that they're making, especially in terms of drug use. And so to have this adult that is giving them 100% of their attention and time geared towards that youth and empowering them and helping them learn and grow. And another thing is the social confidence training. So all of that, just giving the youth the tools they need to be in their communities and do good for their communities. And just being able to be in social settings with their peers, learning how to say no to the drugs, and just having a more positive effect on their lives. So treatment as another form of intervention, obviously this kind of is the control aspect or the after the fact. So if the youth are engaging in substance use and they end up in the juvenile justice system, one thing I know Katelyn and Dejion have both touched on is the multi-systemic therapy. And I won't go into much detail because it's already been said, but just really addressing the family, the peers, and then the issue at hand with the youth. So coupling all of that together and addressing it head on, so that it builds, so that the problem can be addressed, and then going into building their self-esteem and their confidence to be able to, separate from the problem, to grow and then move in a different direction. And this too, residential programs are used. This is, again, like Katelyn said, more of an intensive programming. And this is when substance use has really turned into substance abuse and addiction for these youth. So rehabilitation is possible for them. And in some cases, while this is necessary, there are instances where these programs aren't readily available for youth due to cost. And so that's one, I guess, con to this idea is that we need, more programs that will allow youth that are at risk, because chances are those at-risk youth are coming from poor communities and don't have the means to enter these residential programs. So if we're implementing that in the juvenile justice system in general, it could really change the lives of these kids dealing with substance abuse issues. And then, of course, other forms of treatment, just in everyday, more of a preventive sense as well, is just the after-school programs and sports, outdoor recreational activities. Both of these, taking the kids from school directly into another activity that they enjoy, that can build their confidence, their communication skills, their learning abilities, that's catering to the positive aspects of their lives and their abilities, and keeping them from going home to maybe a home without parents, or, into the communities where their friends are going to the streets. And instead of engaging in that negative behavior and falling into substance use, they're in these other programs that can just enhance their abilities and their talents, and push them in a different direction as well. And then the last thing, something that the book talked on as well in terms of intervention, is this idea of harm reduction. And that was defined as efforts to minimize the harmful effects caused by drug use. So this is really kind of an educational aspect of an intervention as well. Just the idea that things need to be made more available to these youth, both educationally and physically. The need, like I touched on earlier, for drug treatment, more opportunities for populations in need to get the necessary treatment when dealing with drugs and substance abuse, allowing healthcare workers to, step in and not only teach them about the harmful effects of their drugs, but allowing these healthcare workers to use drugs appropriately to treat their needs, to show them a more positive aspect of the use of drugs when it is necessary and controlled, versus getting them from the streets and using them in a negative way. So just kind of bringing a more positive light to drugs when they are used properly. And then another example the book actually touched on was the use of transferring of needles and sharing needles, and educating people on the harmful effects of that. It talked about transmission of disease such as HIV, and that can start at a young age, and youth that are using it and leading into their adulthood. And like we talked on before, people that are using drug introduced at 16 are more likely to have substance use for the rest of their lives and be within in the juvenile justice system. So just educating them beforehand can make just a huge difference, as well as creating these specified drug courts with additional programs for these children. So if they're coming to these courts for substance possession or use or selling of drugs, to not just give them a sentence and put them in jail and then release them at their designated time, because probably 99% of those people are going back to the same communities doing the same things they were before. And so to kind of buffer that transition back into the community, giving them programs and resources to invest in that person, and then show them ways in which they can say no to drugs, alternatives to using drugs, just giving them a more positive, almost rehabilitation, but just educational and resources that can kind of buffer their transition back into their communities where it's most likely still very prevalent. So all of that is kind of grouped into this idea of harm reduction, and how we can take drugs and use that in a more positive sense.
I'm sorry, I was on mute. So moving forward, so I know you're wondering why we chose this topic to begin with. And it's kind of, to me, it would be more self-explanatory. But for those who it's not so self-explanatory, this topic was chosen because it's a major issue in the community today. It's a major issue nationally, not just here in Louisiana, because more youth are being exposed to drugs. More youth are being exposed to a lot of things that, say, most juveniles or youth usually wouldn't be exposed to, just because of the way social media and television, like, it's exposing, it's putting it all out in the forefront now. So it's such a relevant, number one, and important issue to touch on, because drugs are being popularized nowadays. Even with the legalization of marijuana in different states, it's more like a hobby thing now. They're making it more of like a hobby, instead of, using things for like municipal reasons, mental health, stuff like that. They're using it more so as a gateway or a hobby or something just fun to do, when in actuality, drugs can literally, they can either help or harm you. And in this case, the overutilization of drugs could definitely harm you and cause you to, create and do more delinquent acts, which will then create a cycle. And eventually they will, as the cycle continues, they will end up in becoming adult offenders, not just juvenile offenders, but they will then become adult offenders who continue to do the same thing, and then until they get a long sentence in prison. And even in the case of, they can they can actually do a crime as a juvenile and get charged as an adult. So that's why this topic is so important, and we chose this topic, and it's being discussed.
So the overall knowledge that was gained, just the complexity of it, I think we were all pretty informed on how many different variables go into them using drugs, youths using drugs. Just the different variables you can think of leaving this presentation: protective assets, social bonds, early onset to drug use, trajectory of the drug use, those stages that they go into, peer association, violent delinquent acts, conduct disorder, perspective on youth in our society, and proper prevention programs. I mean, that's all like working against or for these youths. So that's something that we could just keep on remembering when working with this population, and to just inform the community. I mean, this is something that we need to be advocates for and continue to talk about, because with our knowledge of us knowing this now, we can't just hold it in. Like, we need to spread the knowledge to people.
And as well, with the multicultural considerations, some of the big statistics that Dejion shared was showing that 80% of the youth in custody are African American. So obviously the statistic is extremely high, and this population is represented in a negative light through their inflated presence in the juvenile justice system. And so considering that, and looking at the preventions and therapeutic measures, those are all extremely important and can benefit all youths in the juvenile delinquent that are juvenile delinquents, as well as drug users, but advocating specifically for the minority populations that are being overrepresented, that are being discriminated against, picked out in their own communities and on the streets based on their race. And so this behavior within the system, by bringing awareness to it, by advocating for these youth, we could just help shed light on the disproportionate representation of Black youth in the juvenile justice system.
So how does this relate to social work and our values? Just as Erin was saying, like, the discrimination and the racism is a huge part of this. And as social workers, we are supposed to advocate for change and advocate for injustice and vulnerable populations and those living in poverty, just like all of it. So it's all going hand in hand. And then I thought that was interesting, like the defining feature of social work includes like looking at the individual and their social environment. So this is what we did in this PowerPoint. That's why this PowerPoint is 45 minutes long. It's because there's so many different elements in the environment that are affecting these youth. So we can't just look at the youth and say, you're the problem. Like, we have to look at the environment and say, that's the problem, and we're going to help you get out of the problem. So that was what just really stuck out to us, was looking at all the different areas and not ignoring one small area or one big area. And then the implications, person in the environment, which I just mentioned, and then Dejion is going to touch on trauma focused.
So just bringing up the trauma focused community. What I mean by that is basically informing the community and those who will be interacting with these juvenile delinquents or interacting with the youth on a daily, allowing them to be trauma informed. That basically means that when you encounter a youth who has, been committing these delinquent acts or whatever, just like the young man, just to bring up the young man who stole a school bus. When you approach this kid, this 11-year-old kid, and you're getting him off of the school bus that he has stolen and basically went on a joyride around Baton Rouge, you have to approach him in a different way than you would approach an adult who has done this, because you have to understand that this is a traumatic experience. How you react to him could be traumatic, and it can play a huge role in how he perceives things going forward, and also how the cycle continues, or if it does continue with delinquent acts. So that definitely is a huge concern. Informing not only police officers, but teachers, parents, the entire community, that the things we do and how we react to certain situations should be trauma informed, because it can create traumatic effects on the youth and the children in our community.
And then going back to, in terms of social work implications, the education in communities, as well as for our fellow social workers. So we hope that this presentation is educational for our classmates, just bringing awareness to the drug use and its prevalence with our youth, as well as educating our communities. And, that can be for anyone. We need to educate the youth as well as adults. Everyone, the more we create awareness of this issue, the better chance we have at tackling it, and making a difference and making change in the lives of these youth. So that's definitely an important aspect of our role as social workers as well. Lastly, just some critiques on the research. I feel like it can always be said that we need more, but I still think that's true of this topic, especially in terms of the multicultural considerations. We need more research done on the realm of drug use and the impact it has on the at-risk youth, but looking at, where those youth are coming from and their communities, and looking more at their environment more than the youth. And there's a fair amount of research on the preventative measures that don't work, instead of research on implementing new programs and testing their effectiveness on various populations. So that was something I feel like we ran into a little bit, was a lot of the things that did not work, but we're not seeing as much research on the interventions that did work and that have positive results for these youths. But ultimately, through our research, we became a lot more aware of the harmful effects of the early drug use, and the need to be better for the juvenile justice system approach to this issue for delinquent youth, and just treating it properly instead of punishing it unjustly. We need to look at it as an issue of environment, and looking at the drug as the problem, again, like we've said, and not just the youth, and addressing that head on.
And these are our references.
Thanks for listening.
Thank y'all for joining. Thanks for listening in, and we hope you have a good day.
Yes. Bye.